You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast.
All right, y'all, it is finally that time. We talked about Harrison Ford. We talked about Jack Ryan. We talked about Star Wars. Now it's time to enter into my wheelhouse and talk about the man, the myth, the legend, Wes Craven himself. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the SG Drive-In. And for this monumentous occasion, I am joined by a special guest. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, man?
What's up? If you guys listen to my horror podcast, Abyss Gazing, you guys know me as Josh. If you guys listen to my mental health podcast, you guys know me as Captain Nostalgia.
So Dali and Celeste told me that you had those two worlds melded, and I think it's fantastic. The mental health world and the horror world, absolutely.
Yeah, so we also do a horror podcast, if I can plug that, or not horror podcast, a horror film festival as well.
Yeah.
So if any of your listeners happen to be screenwriters or filmmakers or actors, we are currently accepting submissions for our 2023 submission season. It will be held on April 14th and 15th at the Alamo Draft House in Winchester, Virginia. And that is the first time that I've ever actually announced the date to this as well. So
nice.
There's an exclusive for you guys.
Fantastic. So we've covered a whole gambit of different drive-in movies, different blockbusters. We've covered what a blockbuster is, but all along the way, we have been asking one very important question. So I will go ahead and ask you this. You're at the movies, you're getting ready to see a flick. What's your go-to snack?
My go-to snack is always got to be cookie dough bites.
Oh, yeah.
Every time. I don't know what it is. I used to, before they switched, my go-to was always cookie dough bites and cherry Coke. So
nice.
It's my two things.
Nice. Yeah, I am a cherry Coke fan at heart. I absolutely love cherry Coke. Yeah, so let's go ahead and crack into this. You know, Wes Craven is one of those guys that has been man, he's done a little bit of everything, and being a 90s kid, I grew up on his stuff. We were talking before we came on air. You know, I was like 5 the first time that I ever saw Dream Warriors, which is Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, and then Nightmare 1, Scream 2, so on and so forth. So what was your first introduction to Wes Craven?
I'm also a 90s kid. I grew up in more of a conservative household, so like horror wasn't accessible till I was like a teenager and like well into adulthood. But my first one was Scream. Like I remember, like I caught it on. We had like a free trial of like Showtime or Stars, and I like when my sister and I turned 13, we each got a television in our room with a cable box. And so I just remember like Thanksgiving weekend, Stars or like one of those premium channels had played Scream 1, 2, and 3. And I just watched them all. And I was probably like 14. It was like I was just enthralled. And I didn't get to like really crack into any other Craven probably till I was like 17 or 18. And of course I went for like a Nightmare on Elm Street. Oddly enough, the only other movie of Craven's that I had seen is like his Anomaly, which is Music of the Heart. Like I was probably like 12 when I saw that movie.
Right.
And all I remember about it was like Gloria Estefan and NSYNC did a music video for it, and I was like, oh, okay. It's very weird to know that you go from Scream 2 that to Scream 3.
Right. Well, it's funny to me that, you know, this conversation that we're having has this, you know, when you talk about horror directors, it's kind of rarefied air, especially in this generation of filmmakers. And a lot of times guys like John Carpenter will also enter into this conversation. That's that's like a 1A and 1B sort of situation for me as far as just some of the absolute best to do it. And you know, it's funny, a lot of these guys have these anomalies in their portfolio, where you see some of these tentpole movies that, while they might not necessarily be the definition of a blockbuster per se, you're talking about guys that created IPs. I mean, New Line Cinema is literally known as the house that Freddie built. You know what I mean? Like, New Line was nothing until Freddie came along. And then, same thing with John Carpenter and Halloween. He created this thing that's now lasted for generations. And both of these guys have these movies also attached to their CV that are just, anything but horror.
Yeah, it's interesting because Craven is kind of like ebbs and flows, to where like he has these like really grounded pictures that are like, oddly enough, like based in like reality and like history, with like, his first two features, Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes. And then you get into like the 80s and he's got going this like more fantastical route with A Nightmare on Elm Street, New Nightmare, and then Shocker, which is vastly underappreciated in my opinion.
Agreed.
But then you get into like other like hidden gems in his career, like Cursed and like Swamp Thing. Like, say what you will about Swamp Thing, like I love that movie and all of its cheese. Like, I think it's one of his like more interesting pictures to talk about because it doesn't necessarily feel like a Wes Craven movie. And that's really what I like, because you can see something like that, or like Red Eye, where here are movies that, like you said, like this is the guy that like brought Freddy and Ghostface to life and can like do these like really just terrifying visions of terror, but then like turn around and do like camp and like wholesome movies as well.
Right. And so this conversation was originally born out of covering what are considered blockbusters from the years that the various hosts were born. And one of our esteemed hosts was born in 1972, which was the year for Last House on the Left. And so, you look at a movie like that, right? That was you want to talk about hardcore, y'all. If you're gonna go and watch Craven stuff, go watch Craven stuff. But seriously, just be aware of what you're watching. It's not for young eyes. You know what I mean? I sit here and talk about how I was so young watching Craven stuff that like viewer discretion is absolutely advised. Yeah. Before watching that sort of thing. But you go for something like you watch the pendulum swing from something like Last House on the Left. That's just, I think the best way to describe that movie is mean. That movie is just a mean movie. And then you go to something like Swamp Thing that tackles nuanced subject matter, and you can kind of pick that apart a little bit more to find more of the underlying themes, especially for somebody like me who's the resident DC guy out of the group. I absolutely have a soft spot in my heart for that movie.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because like you're welcoming in truly for specifically like The Last House on the Left. Like, I mean, that is probably one of the most brutal movies I've ever seen. And that and like I Spit on Your Grave are like two movies that I'm like, if you ever have to like really want to be a completionist, but like they're movies that like I don't necessarily recommend just because of the subject matter. It's probably actually those particular two movies that like I don't like to like advocate or like watch movies that deal with that subject matter. Not saying that I won't stray away from it, but like my both my parents were victims of sexual assault, so like that movie hits really hard for me from a different angle of mental health as well, because I've seen what that journey is like on the other side. And I think Swamp Thing is a really interesting like blip on his career, because it's the, it, like I said, like it's a little bit deeper. Like, yes, it's by today's standards, it's kind of hokey and it's kind of campy, but it was kind of a movie that was kind of showing like the actual like terror of pollution and other things as well that kind of fall in on that. And that was kind of the like first time that he kind of attacked, I don't want to say social commentary, but like it was kind of it's kind of a lighter version of social commentary than The Last House on the Left.
Yeah. Yeah, when you look at the whole breadth of Wes Craven's stuff, I remember the first time that I ever watched Last House on the Left. I was in my teens somewhere in there, and if you're looking at if you've got the volume knob, right, I would put Scream somewhere in the probably 6-7 range. Nightmare on Elm Street, I'm a little biased because I was young when I saw it, and so that movie did freak me out at points. But like, it was still, you're still maybe looking at a 7 somewhere in that ballpark. You watch that knob go all the way up to 11 in that, but being able to process all of that now as somebody who understands what kind of Wes Craven's mentality towards filmmaking and, understanding a little bit more of the dumpster fire that is this world and all of that, you can kind of see the same kind of through line that's not horribly surprising to watch the same guy that makes, Last House on the Left and Swamp Thing and stuff like that, making movies like Scream and New Nightmare and all of that. So for those of you that don't know, Wes Craven is probably the most famous meta horror director that there is. I'm not sure there's somebody more famous for doing meta horror than him. Do you think that's safe to say?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think it'll be generations before we ever see someone kind of take that crown from him, because while Radio Silence did a good job with the most recent Scream,
yeah,
it's still like you can't, while I will say like Wes would be proud, I still feel like you can't ever take away like what he was able to bring commentary wise on what the slasher genre was at in the 90s when the first one came out, what sequels look like, even what trilogies look like, and then reboots. And I'm curious to see where they're going to go with the next one, part 6. But yeah, I think that's definitely safe to say that he's probably the most meta horror director we've ever gotten.
Yeah, I remember first time I ever saw New Nightmare, it was on TV. It was on TBS and or TNT, one of the two Turner stations. And I remember being so enthralled at the idea that Freddy was in the real world, that they were crossing that boundary into bringing Freddy into the real world. And it was just this different, it just hit different for me because there's almost this line of separation, right? He's only in the dreams. He's only in that part of, but that part of reality, and that's all movie and all of that. But like, no. Yeah, they did some crossover where at moments they called Heather Langenkamp Nancy and all of that, and they started marrying those worlds a little bit. But like, no, these are like the actual people, and like Robert Englund played himself in at different points and things like that. And like that to me is those kinds of movies are the kinds of movies that walked so that way people like Radio Silence could run, because anything that they do, and even like movies like The Strangers and stuff like that these movies that people herald as like, oh, I don't know if I necessarily like touching that part of horror because it's like a little bit too true to heart. Like I was a little bit younger than the main characters of Scream when I saw it for the first time, but like this was an example of like some of our own just losing their minds and going on a killing spree. You know what I mean? And then you see the copycat people based off of the movie and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, man.
Yeah. And so, you look at movies like this, and it's I think movies like this are easy to kind of the throw away by some, because especially in our community, I know sometimes it's hard for people that are Christian, or that are like a little bit more lighthearted stuff. And we talk a lot about things like Marvel and all of those kinds of things, and that kind of stuff. These movies kind of catch a bad rap, but from a cinematic standpoint, these are the movies that really poke and prod and dare to ask questions, because they have that hint of realism. And then on the flip side, you have the original Nightmare on Elm Street, right? You have all of his stuff that looks a little bit more true to life, even back to Last House on the Left or The Hills Have Eyes. The Hills Have Eyes kind of, I would argue, marries those two worlds of being a little bit more of a creature feature mixed with nuance of more of that true to life stuff. But you have something like Freddy. I argue that without Freddy, you don't have a lot of even what came between Freddy and Scream. You know what I mean? It's almost like he went from high note to high note, revolutionizing the horror genre as a whole, and then giving us all of these blockbusters along the way that MTV Freddy and Freddy's on literally everything and all of that kind of stuff.
That's probably one of my favorite aspects of just social commentary when you look at New Nightmare. If you've never don't know any of how big Freddy Krueger got in the late 80s, then I highly recommend checking out the Never Sleep Again documentary, which is a great documentary because just to kind of put this in perspective, when Freddy Krueger actually died in the 6th installment, they actually hosted a funeral for him. And they did billboards, and Freddy Krueger kind of reached this he was a sensation. There's no other way to really describe him. There's no really other horror icon that has ever kind of reached that status. Yes, you have cults like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Charles Lee Ray, and Ghostface. You have those cults, but they just stay as cult status. Freddy really dominated and proved, like you said, MTV. There's Freddy Rap out there. There's and there's a scene in New Nightmare where Nancy and not Nancy, Heather Langenkamp and Robert Englund are doing a talk show appearance, and you just see children in this audience actually cheering for Freddy. Right. And it's such a meta moment, but it's that's a picture of Freddy Krueger at his pinnacle height. It's the reason why people are still clamoring for him to come back. And Wes Craven created something that has unfortunately outlived him, but I think we've seen now the landscape of horror that this is a genre that is crafting storytellers that are more than capable to raise to the level and pay the respect and homage of what has come before it.
And I'm glad that you raised that point, because and I'm glad that you gave the plug that you did at the beginning, because in my opinion, horror is a genre that produces some of the very best storytellers that are around. Yeah, sure, there's fantasy, there's tons of long in the tooth genres that produce perfectly fine storytellers. But if you read enough things like fantasy, and you read enough comics and different things like that, so much that comes out has a way of kind of being derivative in a lot of respects. But you look at something like Freddy, right? you have this story that is loosely based on some real life events that Wes Craven had heard about of people that were essentially dying in their sleep, and all of that, and morphs it into this somewhat simple story that just catches fire through and through honestly, despite themselves in a lot of respects as far as New Line goes, because they really didn't do themselves a lot of favors going forward, and he didn't really want to continue the franchise or anything like that. But like, it's stunning to me how this genre can produce so many people that are just solidly good at telling a story.
Well, I think too, you mentioned this earlier, like the thing about horror is that it's so interlaced with specifically so many social commentaries.
Yeah.
And so like that's the reason why, I co-run a podcast with my co-host Mark, of doing abyss gazing, because there's so many parallels that run where you can talk openly about mental health and horror. And then on the flip side of that, you also have that's the reason why it's so easy for us to do a film festival that is being horror focused, or sorry, horror centric, but mental health focused. And likewise, on the flip side of that, like even being a Christian, I find that like sometimes there are more open conversations that can be had in horror about religion or religious undertones, or however you want to say it, that they're attacking certain topics that I feel like the church even today won't address. And I don't want to, that's like a whole nother podcast, but for me, like that's kind of the reason why I'm such a vocal defender of the horror genre, because it does get a lot of unfortunate bad reps within the church.
Yeah. So this conversation started around the same time with a former co-host that was a part of SG, that when we talked about Scream 5, when that came out. And we started having these conversations peppered along the way, and we talked about the Halloween Kills when that came out, and all of that kind of stuff. And we started talking about these different horror topics, and it had a way of polarizing the fan base in certain regards. Not everybody was a big fan that we started talking about these things. And sure. I am of that same opinion that, let's go ahead and swing that pendulum back the other direction for a minute and start talking about some of his more extreme stuff, right? Sure. Who else is out here openly talking about, like, these are things that, it makes us uncomfortable because it's reality, because there is a reality to it. And there's a reality to the fact that some of these things, they do happen. Does somebody dress up in a white mask and terrorize a Midwestern town, every Halloween? No. Does a dream demon go around killing teenagers in a particular, no. But there are still themes and nuances to this that, even if they make you uncomfortable, I'm not going to necessarily go watching those more extreme examples, but I not honestly, because for the same reasons that you expressed, they're subject matter that just hits a little close for home. I watched them. I checked it off the bucket list. It is what it is, and I move on with my life. But the reality is that doesn't stop them from being very real topics that just don't get talked about. And that's what you're saying is something that is so unfortunately true, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing about it is, and like too, I think coming from like a flip side because I've also dealt with a lot of criticism for the fact that I have tattoos like up and down all of my arms. And so it's like, even now, like having old Michael Myers tattooed on my hand, like I still like have those like occasional conversations that come through. But I think a lot of it sometimes is just like a misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge. And that's oftentimes that, like, when I've engaged in ministry or like ministry opportunities, like I want to educate people. Like the reason that I watch this stuff is to like openly discuss and like bring Jesus to the horror community, but also on the flip side of that is like I want to educate people and like have like really real conversations and like let them know that like, hey, you're not alone. Like I think it's 2020, there was over 42,000 people that took their own lives. For every successful one of those, like there was 25 more that were being attempted. Suicide's currently the 12th leading cause of death in our country. And then when you get into kind of like tying it back into the last house on the left, there is, when you talk about sexual assault, there is so much injustice that happens there that I think the statistic, if I remember correctly, is like only 10 to 25, I could be wrong, it's somewhere in that range, of all perpetrators actually 10 to 25 out of every 1,000 actually see the inside of a jail cell. And like every 9 minutes, a sexual assault victim happens to be a child. It's these very real topics that, because they're uncomfortable, we just don't want to address. And Jordan Peele, I think, is a great modern storyteller that we get. Like Nope, Get Out, Us. Like, here are topics that, here are things that we're evolving, stories about racism, how our society marginalizes people, classism, the mental health, and how we view celebrities, and like all of these other like little things. And Jordan Peele is presenting these very amazing narratives, but he's also making us like look in the mirror at the same time.
Right. And that's, I would argue that that's where horror shines the brightest, is when you can have somebody that can successfully do something like that, where they are telling a story. Yeah, there is, all of this is wrapped up in solidly good storytelling, but also is willing to hold the mirror up and is willing to, get a little uncomfortable to be able to tell that story and to address the issue and all of that. And I love the way that you brought that out. There was a litany, honestly, of conversations that took place that after the latest Halloween. Halloween 2018 was what it was, but Halloween Kills really, like, they very much specifically went to try and recapture the idea of carnage candy, as a lot of people say, that blood, guts, and gore factor and all of that. And there was a lot of interesting conversations that popped up along the way of whether or not Christians should be having or should be watching these things. And I remember with Scream 5, with that, I could separate myself a little bit from the carnage, because it was almost like, it was so spectacle in nature that it was easy to separate from. In Scream 5, in that practical effect that they did with Wes in the next scene that they did, oh, dude, I couldn't tell you the last time I was that uncomfortable watching a horror flick. Like, it had been a while since a movie made me that uncomfortable, because it let you sit in it. You know what I mean? And yeah. There were a lot of these conversations that I was able to have that ended up stemming into being able to show people Jesus by way of talking about these things and being able to incorporate these things and have these things be the entry point into a much deeper conversation, all stemming from this guy that created, we're not necessarily, this episode of the drive-in is a little bit different because this is a guy that pumped out IPs that generated blockbusters over and over and over again. You know what I mean? And if you're willing to get your hands dirty, if you're willing to sit and have those kinds of conversations, then yeah, this is a prime opportunity to be able to show people Jesus in an area that so desperately needs it.
Yeah, you're talking about like the intersection between Wes Craven's career and even bringing up conversations that lead to Jesus and to Scripture. Even we brought up Scream, but I mean, like, Scream is like the idea of idolatry and the idea of what happens when fandom goes wrong, but also at the same time, like, if you've seen Scream, then that and Scream 2, that the entire motivation for that particular killer in each their respective thing was vengeance. And Jesus talks specifically about, like, if you hate your brother in your heart, you've already committed the act of murder. And that's essentially what you see between those two films, those 4 hours, is the act of Jesus talking about out of the mouth the heart flows.
Yeah. And we had the last time that I sat down for a drive-in episode, we were talking about Superman 2, and we were talking about identity and the deeper themes and all of that kind of stuff. And it's one thing, we talk about a lot of the time on SG, these exploring the deeper ideas behind a lot of these IPs, allowing for poking and prodding and pushing against the boundaries to ask those deep questions and explore things in a more nuanced way. And to me, specifically with Wes Craven's stuff, watching all of his stuff as I've gotten older, it's almost like watching it with a new set of eyes. Now, yeah, 5 years ago, I ended up with a new set of eyes, air quotes. You know what I mean? When I had my salvation experience and all of that. And so, yes, it is a new perspective and things like that. But even beyond the Christian perspective, getting older and now looking back on it, having experienced all of the things that I've experienced in my life, it's like watching all of these things with a fresh set, almost like for the first time, because I'm able to pull out those different things, those deeper things. I'm so glad that you talked about, the idolatry piece specifically, because even through the newer ones that seem to be a little bit more divided in whether or not they're considered good or not, you look at Scream 4 and Scream 5, yeah, they're literally all about idolatry. They're literally all about vengeance, and these are real things that people experience. And so, yeah, maybe sometimes it takes something fantastical to be able to at least start the conversation and at least be able to start to explore these deeper topics. And that's true right across the board.
Yeah, I also want to bring up another, like, great example of, like, misunderstanding, because, like, I fell into this camp for years, is, like, because the church of, like, when it comes to, like, demonology or, like, hell, like, those also seem to be taboo topics, oddly enough. And a couple of years ago, like, I ended up, like, actually sitting down to read The Exorcist. And, like, what I found in reading that book and, like, rewatching the movie is that I think that that particular piece of media gets, like, oh, this is about a girl that gets possessed and she does, really terrible, awful things. And like when you read it, it's like this is actually about a story of a priest who loses his mother, and he's trying to like find out like why he believes what he believes. And for anyone that has been in the faith for such a long period of time, I feel like that's such a relatable thing that like we don't ever want to talk about, or we don't ever want to address, because it's like, well, you know, we're always supposed to believe, like we're always supposed to be honest. Like, no, dude, like I have days where like I don't hear from God. I question like, is my entire like faith up to this point like even worth it? Has it been like legitimate? And then like I have this like David moment where like I'm reminded of like all the good that God has done me. And it's like, even when I feel like David crying out in Psalm 69, like I'm still going to rejoice, because I know that like there are days where I don't hear from you. I don't feel moved by you, and that's okay. Because, you know, at the end of the day, like I love the line from Waymaker that talks about like, even when I can't see you moving, or even when I can't feel you moving, you never stop. And that is such a beautiful reminder. And, you know, I think sometimes you need those reminder that like it's going to be okay.
Yeah, there's so much with what you just said. You know, the reality of this world is, and I say this on my main project a lot, over at Buddy Walk. You know, when I am preaching or evangelizing or whatever you want to call it over there, when I'm talking to people and pastoring people and all of that, I hear all of these stories, right? If you are somebody that ministers to people, a lot of the time you will hear some of the most heartbreaking stories. And you look at that, and you know, for so many people, I wish that I wish I could take it all away. I wish I could cupcake it and say that following Jesus makes all of that okay. And I look at my life, and I look at the things that I have been through, and you know, I have hit this point of I cannot negotiate my way out of the fact that this life is hard. And for those of us that sit here and talk about it, I think it's easy sometimes for the misconception to get born that, you know, if we have the faith to stand and talk about it and to be so resolute about it, then we must not ever face rocky ground or moments of doubt and all of those kinds of things. Let me tell you something. I make the joke that on the days where you hear me talking a lot about apologetics and things like that, you can pretty solidly understand that those are the days where my brain is going in every single direction. You know what I mean? Like I just want something to tell me that that everything that I've put my stock into, everything that I've put my belief in is real, is true, and all of that. And those days absolutely come. And then we have these moments of being reminded, like you said, that that this is it is all real. It is all, you know, it's everything that it claims to be. And one of the most beautiful things that I have found, you know, I think sometimes we wait for God to come in and remove the giants or slay the giants from our lives and all of that. No, sometimes the giants are gonna knock you on your backside.
Yeah.
And the fact that we can look at in our own lives, in media, in whatever, to these horrific truths about this reality, about this world that we live in, about this fallen world that we live in. And we can then say, in the midst of all of that, the one thing that we can hang our hat on is Jesus. Yeah, that's beauty. That's where you can take a step back in my opinion.
Yeah, and like even to like bring it back to Craven, like I feel like sometimes it's really easy to relate to like whether you're talking about Nightmare on Elm Street, you're talking about New Nightmare, both Nancy and Heather kind of go through this like gaslighting phase where you're like questioning the very things that your like eyes are seeing, or like the things that you're experiencing, and then you kind of finally come face to face with it. One of my favorite things about the Nightmare on Elm Street is I've gone back and forth with it over the years, but the very ending of that is like how she gets victory is like, I'm just going to turn my back on you and I'm going to strip you of the power. So when we partner with spirits like depression and anxiety and addiction and anger, put whatever any spirits that are not of God, that rob us of our purity, like we have the power through Jesus to not only take every thought captive and make it obedient to him, but also at the same time, like it reminds us that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against rulers, principles, and principalities and rulers of the heavenly realm. That like the thing of that Paul says in Ephesians 6:10 is to be strong in the Lord and in his strength. And it's really easy to like say, I can't feel it, keep pressing. Be encouraged to keep pressing because God never leaves us. He never forsakes us. And Romans says that, nothing separates us from the love of God.
As they say, that'll preach. Um, so I want to round it. I want to round it off with a little bit of fan casting. So what a time to be a horror fan, right? We are looking at the third installment of Halloween. We're looking at another new Scream movie coming out. All of that. The one remake that we have yet to see that fans seem to be clamoring for is Nightmare on Elm Street. So, who do you cast as Freddy?
I want to pick like a really like just left field choice, and my like if you're going for a younger like I say younger, but like probably like middle aged man, I'm gonna say Kevin or not Kevin Bacon's obviously on that list for like an older, more mature like season, not quite as old as Robert Englund yet, but honestly, Adam Scott. I think Adam Scott could he's got the gravity to play like really good dramatic roles, but also at the same time he is has a lot of that charisma. And say what you will about it, I know it's got its followers. I'm kind of here nor there on it, but Hellraiser Bloodlines shows us that he can play a menacing villain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's categorically true, regardless of how you feel about the movie itself. That movie definitely shows that he can play a menacing villain. Yeah, so this is a hot take for some horror fans, but I think Bill Skarsgård cut a dirty hand with the new It movies. I think those It movies, they're fine. They're fine, but they literally watched where the 90s version went off the rails and decided to go exactly off the rails in the exact same spot rather than turn the ship. But I think throughout that whole thing, he showed such a range to be able to be scary, but also be the kind of charismatic that you need to be in order to be Freddy. Yeah, Kevin Bacon, I understand. I see it. I'm not the biggest Kevin Bacon fan, so I understand but I understand why. He's probably the closest that you get to Robert Englund without just bringing him back, which I absolutely do not think that they should do. But yeah, I think that Bill Skarsgård, if I had to guess, or if I had to go with somebody, would be my pick. So we always round it off with some recommendations. So let the people know what you are geeking out on right now and what kind of recommendations for anything you have for the people.
Yeah. So I am right now. I feel like I can't recommend the thing that I'm like, that I am currently reading right now because it's out there. It's a wild ride. It's all I'm gonna say. But right now, like the thing that like I've been geeking out about, I've been kind of like stepping back from horror, and I've actually been jumping into the Bring It On franchise. There are things about that franchise that I don't recommend, but if you grew up in the early aughts, you know about it. So, but keeping in line with this one, I want to recommend some underappreciated movies in Craven's catalog, and I will definitely say Swamp Thing is definitely one of them. New Nightmare and Cursed. So you got one from every decade.
Yeah, those are great examples. So, and for me, I my recommendation is, if you never have, go back and watch some of the classics. If it's something that you can handle, definitely go back and watch some of the classics that we've mentioned here, because it's one of those things that when you watch them, you will be able to, especially if you are a cinephile or, a movie lover, that sort of thing, you will be able to see the fingerprints that these movies left throughout cinema going forward. You know what I mean? You'll be able to see those kinds of evidence points all over the place once you see these classics. So one last time, go ahead and plug your stuff.
Sure. So you guys, victimsandvillains.net or Linktree Victims and Villains, just Google that. But basically that'll get you guys links to all of our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch. You guys can check out all of our podcasts. We have a generalized pop culture podcast. It's called Victims and Villains. We have a horror podcast called Abyss Gazing, and we have a Nicolas Cage podcast called That's High Praise. And then at the end of the year, beginning of the year, we also have an anime podcast called Animind. All of those are on the same feed. Just search Victims and Villains wherever you guys get your Facebook, your podcast from. You guys can follow us. We're on, like I said, all social medias, all podcast platforms. But if you guys would like more to get involved more with what we're doing right now, we currently have a GoFundMe up for all of our 2023 efforts, including our nonprofit transition, and then as well support us on Patreon at patreon.com/victims and villains.
Well, thank you for joining us, and thank all of you for listening to another installment of the SG Drive-In. And remember that we are all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.
This was an Anazao Ministries podcast. If you enjoyed this show and would like to learn more about our network, be sure to check out the Anazao Ministries Podcast Network.